Hello. The topic of this lecture is a concept known as empiricism. Empiricism is an idea in the branch of philosophy known as epistemology, which is the branch of philosophy that studies how it is people come to form beliefs, how it is that people come to have knowledge, how it is that people come to understand things. Empiricism, as an idea, is one of the most important epistemological ideas of the last several hundred years. The origins of epistemology in philosophical circles, at least in the modern era, go back primarily to this figure here. This is John Locke. Locke is the first of the major theorists of empiricism that we point to. And primarily his views are found in a writing called An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, which was published in 1689. Following Locke, a number of people have sort of picked up the thread and examined things from an empiricist viewpoint. Some of the most prominent include a fellow by the name of George Berkeley. The British say that word Berkeley, even though we in the United States tend to say it Berkeley. In fact, if you're thinking of a town in California where there is a prominent university, it is in fact named for this guy. But in Britain, they say the name Berkeley. He wrote a number of things, including three dialogues between Hylas and Philonous, but also wrote a treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge in 1710 that very much furthered this notion of empiricism. And finally, David Hume, who's probably the most important philosopher ever to have written in English, also made his own contributions to empiricism, primarily in a treatise of human nature published in 1740. And of course, he republished some bits with substantial editing of the treatise in a work called the Enquiries. So the Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding is also a very important source if you're looking to see some of Hume's ideas and how they contribute to a general empiricist worldview. So for the purposes of bar trivia, if somebody asks who are the big three British empiricists, the answer is Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. Right? So what is empiricism? Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a quotation here from Locke to try and to give part of the beginning of where empiricism really gets onto the map. So Locke writes this, and I'm using the Jonathan Bennett edit of Locke's essay concerning human understanding. So the quote reads this: "Let us then suppose the mind to have no ideas in it, to be like white paper with nothing written on it. How then does it come to be written on? From where does it get that vast store which the busy and boundless imagination of man has painted on it? All of the materials of reason and knowledge. To this I answer in one word: from experience." Right? And that's the fundamental statement of what empiricism is as a view. Locke continues. He says, "Our understandings derive all the materials of thinking from observations that we make of external objects that can be perceived through the senses, and of the internal operations of our minds, which we perceive by looking in at ourselves. These two are the fountains of knowledge from which arise all the ideas we have or can naturally have." So this, again, this is empiricism. Empiricism is the view that all of our ideas, right, every idea we have, every piece of content in our minds comes ultimately from our senses, right? Or from experience more broadly. When people talk about experience in the sense of being an empiricist, what they mean is primarily sensory experience. Right? So the idea that all of our ideas come ultimately from experience that is empiricism. And you might want to say, so there's a sense in which empiricism has become the default epistemology among many folks. And so when you say something like, no, we get all of our ideas ultimately from our senses, that doesn't sound very odd, right? It doesn't sound like a very contentious claim, but it is a contentious claim because there are alternatives. The main alternative to empiricism is a view called rationalism, and there are lots of different kinds of rationalism when really there's pretty much just one kind of empiricism. And to see why this is the case, look at what the claim is. Empiricism makes the claim that all of our ideas come from our senses, right? Rationalism makes the claim that at least some ideas come from something other than the senses, right? So depending on how many ideas, which ideas you think those are, and which source other than the senses we get them from, you could get very, very different kinds of rationalism. But there's really pretty much only one way to say that all of our ideas come from our senses ultimately, and that's empiricism. And so empiricism is a very large scope view, and rationalism is largely the denial of empiricism. And so there are lots of different ways to deny the very broad claim. Some of these common rationalist ideas, and I think it's important to see these so that you see some contrast between empiricism and some other potential views. So some common rationalist ideas include intuition. Sometimes also people talk about reason, all right, as a faculty. And this is an idea about where we can get some of our ideas if we don't get them directly from our senses. And so one of the fairly strong examples that rationalists will often bring up in this case are ideas about things like mathematics and geometry, etc. So the idea is you can reason from the fact that 3 is greater than 2 and that 3 is a prime number, that there are prime numbers greater than 2. And it seems like you don't need senses for that, right? That seems to be something that you could arrive at, an idea that you could have by just pure reason. Also, an idea of quantities being larger or smaller than others doesn't appear to need the senses. Also, the idea of prime numbers, right, is another idea that doesn't seem like it absolutely requires the senses. And so this is a fairly good example that rationalists tend to defend, right? These ideas that are gained from pure reason. Descartes, for example, is one famous philosopher that defends something like this view. Another way of being a rationalist, another reasonably strong example that rationalists tend to supply, is an idea of there being innate concepts, that is, things that we're essentially born with, that are essentially hardwired in, things that we don't learn, but that we just sort of come into the world already having in terms of ideas. For example, one good example is the notion of space and of time. Kant, for example, is famous for arguing that we sort of come with those built in, right? We don't learn what space is. We don't learn what time is. We have to already know that in order to sort of experience the world in any coherent way. So his arguments are very difficult but very rewarding. They're very interesting. And so those are some common ways that sometimes people will argue against empiricism. But again, in general, empiricism has had a very widespread influence, and it's been one of the major. It has become, in some sense, the default view of many folks. Now, I want to make sure I distinguish empiricism from something that sounds a little bit like empiricism but isn't. You'll notice earlier when we looked at the Locke quotation, he talked about the mind being like a white paper with nothing written on it, right? And so sometimes people will attribute the term blank slate. They'll attribute that term to Locke, and Locke never actually used that term. The way that many other people use the term blank slate, though, is I want to distinguish that from what empiricism really is. Empiricism is not the view that people are blank slates. Rather, empiricism is the view that all of the ideas we have we get from experience, and that we don't have any innate ideas. So again, it's very important to note that Locke, for example, and nor Berkeley, nor Hume, nor really any of the empiricists, they did not advocate the view that people have no innate abilities, tendencies, or natures, only that they have no innate ideas. Okay, as an epistemological view, empiricism is committed to the idea that people have no innate ideas. This does not mean that they don't have any innate anything else, right? In terms of, for example, abilities, tendencies, or even human natures. Okay, that's those two things are very different views, right? Sometimes when people use the term blank slate, they mean it in this much more expansive sense, right? That people don't have innate abilities, innate tendencies, or innate natures, right? That's not what Locke and company were up to. They were just arguing people have no innate ideas. And so this broader use, this sort of outright denial of human nature, is part of a family of views that hold that all or nearly all human behavior is, as they often say, socially constructed. Those views are all much more recent. In fact, mostly 20th century. And again, this is not to be confused with empiricism. It's not the same thing. If you're interested in such views and what I consider to be a pretty good argument against such views, I would recommend the book The Blank Slate by Harvard scholar Steven Pinker. In the book, Pinker presents, to my mind, a very compelling case that at least some movements in recent social science have gotten sort of carried away with this blank slate view. Have not credited enough of what humans do have innately, and again, it's a really excellent read. All right, so to continue on with empiricism, what I want to do is want to show some examples of sort of the empiricist mode of thought and some of the consequences that thinking like an empiricist have. So I'll start with, and I'll use some examples from our sort of three main characters here, Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. So I'm going to start with Locke's explanation of, of how we come to have ideas. Right, this is his explanation of again, imagine the mind is like a white sheet of paper with nothing written on it. How then does it come to be furnished? Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you an image, and what I want you to do, wherever you're sitting, is just to think carefully, right, and say what is the thing that's up here? What am I showing you? Okay, what is this thing? So we're going to start easy and get a little more difficult. So let's take a look at this. What's that? Okay. And again, think carefully. Go ahead and say it out loud, write it down, whatever. Okay, if you said, that's a chair, duh, okay, I'm going to say, well then, why don't you go and sit on it? Okay. At this point, you'll realize that the thing that seemed very obviously true to you is in fact obviously false. It's not a chair, it's a picture of a chair. Okay, it's an image of a chair, and those are not the same thing. Okay, an image of a chair is not a chair. Otherwise, furniture would be a whole lot cheaper. You can't sit on it, right? I mean, you can sort of sit on your screen, but you're not actually sitting on a chair. So, you're sitting on a picture of a chair that's on your computer screen. Somebody walks in and says, "What are you doing?" You're saying sitting on a chair. People are going to say, "No, you're not," and they're going to be right. Okay, so this is a very simple idea, but it's an idea that illustrates that very often people get onto autopilot, right? They sort of think to themselves something that seems reasonable, but it's of course obviously false because they're not thinking carefully enough. Okay, Locke points this out very clearly. This is a very key concept. Believe it or not, this is sort of the key to understanding some of Locke's thought about the way that we gain ideas and about the nature of experience, right? Because the difference between an image of a thing and the thing itself is very like the difference between an idea of a thing and the thing itself. This is a very, very important concept to understanding how Locke gets where he gets. So just looking at this picture of a chair here, what can you tell about the actual object for sure, right, based on this image of it? And again, say it out loud, call it out, write it down, whatever you want. You're probably going to say something like, well, it's blue, right? It's like, well, but is it? Okay. Do you know that it wasn't simply touched up afterwards, right? In something like Photoshop? Do you know that it wasn't photographed just with a blue lens? Do you know that, et cetera? I mean, there could be all kinds of things, It's like, okay, fine, right? Do you know how big it is? Right? It's like, well, there's no quarter next to it for scale, right? No. Do you know if it's solid or hollow? Again, not from the image. And you say, well, it's three-dimensional. Well, is it? Or is it a picture of a kind of tin cutout of a chair, right? Or is it a picture of a chair even? So I don't know. It's one of those things. You really can't. There's just nothing you really can know for sure about the object itself from the image of it. And so keep in mind this parallel between images and objects is very, very much like the parallel between ideas and objects, and you'll be well on your way to understanding a very key concept that Locke points out that, again, it's sort of obviously correct. It's just that we don't pay attention to that obvious correctness very often. And so here's what Locke has to say about that. He says, to reveal the nature of our ideas better and to talk about them intelligibly, it will be convenient to distinguish them as they are ideas or perceptions in our minds and as they are states of matter in the bodies that cause such perceptions in us. That may save us from the belief, which is perhaps the common opinion, that the ideas are exactly the images and resemblances of something inherent in the object. That belief is quite wrong. Okay? So again, people often take their ideas about what the world is like to be infallible and clear and obvious depictions of what the world really is like. So again, people assume that the ideas they have about things really are just like the things themselves match up perfectly. But of course, that assumption may well not be true. In fact, Locke says in many cases it's clearly false. You know, again, it's sort of this intellectual autopilot that leads us to think that it's so obviously true. So ideas are the entities that the mind deals with, not actual objects, right? Keep that in mind. When you see something, you don't have that thing in your mind. You have an idea of that thing in your mind. So think about it this way: when you look at a mountain, do you gain any weight? Well, of course not, because there's not a mountain in your mind. There is an idea of a mountain in your mind. And the question will eventually become, how do we know that the one thing really does resemble the other? But before we get to that question, we want to answer the question of how we get these ideas in the first place. That is, you know, how in Locke's phrases, how does this blank piece of paper come to be written on? And so when Locke says experience, right, from experience we get all our ideas. By experience, he means a couple of different processes. And one of those is something like this. Okay, are you getting any ideas from this? Surely you're getting the idea of redness, okay? It's very, very simple. There's not very many more ideas to be gotten from this. Maybe the idea of rectangleness, right? Or something like that. But the idea is that something out there affects your senses in such a way as creates an idea in you. Locke describes it this way. He says, first, our senses, when applied to particular perceptible objects, convey into the mind many distinct perceptions of things, according to the different ways in which the objects affect them. That's how we come by the ideas we have of yellow, white, heat, cold, soft, hard, bitter, sweet, and so on, the so-called sensible qualities. And so he says that this is the way essentially our senses work. Something affects our senses. Our senses are sort of devices, you know, they're machines in a sense. That they take in a kind of input and they give us a kind of output. Whatever they're getting on one end is the input, right? You know, however things are affecting them, and then the output we get from them are our ideas. Now, he says this, he says, when I say the senses convey these ideas into the mind, I don't mean this strictly and literally, because I don't mean to say that an idea actually travels across from the perceived object to the person's mind, right? So there's not like if there's a blueberry or something out there, it's not sending this blueberry idea from the blueberry into our minds. That's not what he's saying here. He says rather, the blueberry itself, whatever it is, affects our senses in such a way that certain ideas are created from that interaction. And so this great source, he says, of most of the ideas we have, I call sensation. Okay, so sensation is one of two kinds of experience for Locke. But of course, this is something of a puzzle for empiricists. If the empiricist says, look, we get all of our ideas from experience, then you present them with something like this. And so what's this? Go ahead and shout it out, write it down, whatever. So I'm sure you're being more careful now. I'm sure you're saying it's a picture of whatever, right? And in this case, you'll say it's a picture of a unicorn. Okay, well, great. We're all on the same page there. I agree. This is a picture of a unicorn. But notice, how did you know that? Where did you get the idea of a unicorn? Right? If Locke is and other empiricists, if they're correct that we get all of our ideas from experience, how could you possibly have an idea of a unicorn given that you couldn't possibly have experienced a unicorn because they don't exist? Right? Now I might say something like, well, somebody told me about a unicorn, or I read about one in a storybook or something like that. But that just pushes the problem back. Where did they get the idea if you can't have an idea without experience? Right, now think about this for a minute. This is an honest-to-goodness, puzzle for empiricists, but it's one that empiricists relatively easily solve. Again, think about it for a good little while. If you need more time, go ahead and pause this. So the correct answer is that we assemble a picture like this one out of things we have experienced. So look, I mean, what is a unicorn? It's a horse with a horn on it, okay? We have experienced horses. That's where we get our ideas about horses, is from experience of horses. And we get ideas of horns from experience of horns, right? I mean, we see lots of things that have lots of different kinds of horns. And so does it really take that much to sort of, in your mind, take the ideas you get from horses and the ideas you get from horns and just put them together? Right? It's not so hard, right? And we can say that, look, the elements of all these ideas really do come from experience. And that's how Locke addresses issues like this. He says, secondly, the other fountain from which experience provides ideas to the understanding is the perception of the operations of our own mind within us. Being conscious of those actions of the mind and observing them in ourselves, our understandings get from them ideas that are as distinct as the ones we get from bodies affecting our senses. Every man has this source of ideas wholly within himself, and though it is not sense, because it has nothing to do with external objects, it is still very like sense, and might properly enough be called internal sense. I call this reflection because the ideas it gives us can be had only by a mind reflecting on its own operations within itself. So for Locke, this is the other kind of experience. This is what he calls reflection. This is this awareness of our own ideas. He says, so look, you've seen horses, you've seen horns, and one of the things you can do is you can then take those ideas you have seen and then combine them around and compare and contrast them and sort of think about the ideas after you've got them. And he thinks that lots of the ideas we get are from a process kind of like that. But of course, ultimately, these ideas come from our senses. That's where we, get all of the real input. Now, and then once we have ideas from the senses, then we can do various other things in terms of recombining, comparing, contrasting, abstracting, all of those other sorts of things from which we get so many of our other ideas. But ultimately, Locke is going to sort of say that all of our ideas they come from the senses through one of these two procedures, either directly in the case of things that we directly sense, or indirectly in the case of reflection. And so it's at this point that Locke comes to something of a realization, right? He says, look, it's evident that the mind knows not things immediately. And so by immediately, he doesn't mean like right away in time. He means immediately in the sense of there's no mediation, there's no intervening step. Right? We don't get, our ideas don't come directly from the world, right, without intervening steps. Our senses are those intervening steps that stand between our ideas and actual objects themselves. It's like he says, but only by the intervention of the ideas it has of them. Our knowledge, therefore, is real only so far as there is conformity between our ideas and the reality of things. But what shall be here the criterion? How shall the mind, when it perceives nothing but its own ideas, know that they agree with things themselves? Right, that's a really tough question, and I think you can put it in the sense of a kind of analogy, right? Imagine that you're in a room, it's just a little bunker, no door, no windows, no way to tell what's going on outside. You can't hear through the walls, so the only stuff you have experience of is what happens inside the walls. But there's a little bit of a slot, through which, you can't really see through it. But every day, or what you assume is every day anyway, a newspaper gets dropped through that little slot right into your little room. And that's the only way that you know about what's going on outside of that room. Okay. So this picture is very much like the picture of where we are inside of our own minds, right? What we have our ideas, okay, we have all of those. But the question is, how do we know that our ideas match up with the way that things themselves really are, right? Because again, all we have are the ideas. We can't step out somewhere and sort of look at our idea from outside of our mind and then look at the thing from outside of our mind and then compare them to see how close they are. That's just not available to us. So what you'd need in order to be able to trust that newspaper fully, or to really understand what's going on outside your little box, is you'd have to read the events in the newspaper and then actually see the events outside the box and then compare them to see how close they are. But if you can't get outside the box, you can't do that. Okay? And so a couple of ways that people try and get out of this are by saying, perhaps first they say, well, look, every time, I look at an orange, it looks orange or something like that. It must really be orange then. Okay, so imagine now, so that's consistency, in other words. They say, oh, the consistency means that I can really trust that my ideas really do resemble the objects themselves. But I mean, just imagine you're sitting in that box and the newspaper comes in, you're like, yeah, I have no reason to trust this necessarily, that what it says about the world outside my box is true. Uh, Now imagine you got two newspapers, or 100, or even 1,000 copies of the same newspaper. Does that help? Right? Does that make you any more certain that it tells you things as they really are? It shouldn't. So consistency and truth are not the same thing. Things can be consistently wrong or consistently mistaken. And so that's not going to help. The other thing is to say, well, look, when I describe a blueberry and somebody else describes a blueberry, we sort of describe the same thing. So obviously it must be correct. But that's a bad argument as well. Because if what's in question is whether what is outside of your own ideas matches up with your ideas, look, other people are outside your own ideas, also, are outside of your own mind too. And so if the very question is how reliable are things outside of my mind, you can't use things that are outside of your mind as evidence. Right, that would be circular and silly. And so we're going to be moving on from Locke's, Locke's essentially answer to this problem was that you really can't, right? And this is part of the enduring legacy of empiricism is just this realization that we cannot get outside of our own ideas to see how well they match up to things themselves. That's just not available. And in fact, this illustration is owed to George Berkeley. And you can actually do this, all by yourself. This nice little sort of philosophical thought experiment. You can make it a real experiment, even though it doesn't, won't tell you anything more as a real experiment than as a thought experiment. So just imagine that you have had one hand in some ice water, like some really cold water, and then the other hand in some warm water, not too hot, right? Don't want to burn yourself. And then you take, you leave your hands in there for a couple of minutes, right? And then you take both of those hands and just put them in the same container, right? It's the same bowl of room temperature water, right? That water is going to feel warm on the hand that has been in the cold water, and it will feel cold on the hand that has been in warm water. And yet you know that it's the same water that both of your hands are in, but you're just getting completely different ideas about the temperature of that water. And so Berkeley's suggestion here is that suggests that a great many of the kinds of things that we take when we're sort of on intellectual autopilot to be properties of the outside world, right, that are just part, it's like we think, no, the hotness or the coldness, that's in the water, right? And Berkeley indicates that, that perhaps that's not true, that a lot of our ideas of things don't necessarily match up to anything that's actually outside of our minds, but they're things that just are simply ideas. That don't have anything that corresponds on the outside of our minds, right? It's another sort of enduring legacy of empiricism. And finally, the last example I wanted to take a look at is the example of cause and effect. And this comes from David Hume's Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. And so I'm going to start off this with a little bit of a quote from Hume that explains what he's up to. He says, "All reasonings about matters of fact seem to be based on the relation of cause and effect, which is the only relation that can take us beyond the evidence of our memory and senses." Okay, so I'm going to pause there for a second. He says cause and effect is the only thing that can take us beyond the evidence of our memory and senses. So think of it this way. Do you think of yourself, do you like apples? Okay, and if you want to say, well, either yes or no, notice what you've got now is an opinion of what all apples are like, even though you haven't had all apples. Okay, and so the idea, but you think that, right, the ideas you have about the apples you haven't eaten are still accurate because you think the apples you have eaten are going to be very much like the ones that you haven't, right? And that there's, they're going to have, because there are causes, right? There are things that make an apple the way it is, and you think that continues to operate. Notice if I asked you, did the sun rise 158 years ago, right? You will say, sure it did, right? Not because you were there, not because you have any memory of it, but because you think, well, look, the sun rises for a reason, and as far as I know, those reasons still obtained, right? So if you want to have beliefs about things that you don't have any direct experience with, either in the distant past or in the future, or just, the apples you haven't yet eaten, all of that stuff seems to rely on this idea of cause and effect, right? We sort of bring in this idea of cause and effect whenever we want to say something about stuff that we haven't ourselves seen, or experienced. which, again, includes lots of our beliefs are about things that are outside of our experience. So here Hume is asking questions about how we come to have beliefs about things that are outside of our experience, because we do. And what we do is we sort of extrapolate from what we do have experience of. And again, this is a very empiricist way to go about things. So he continues, he says, we suppose that the present fact is connected with the one we infer from it. If there were nothing to bind the two facts together, the inference of one from the other would be utterly shaky. So if we want to understand the basis of our confidence about matters of fact, we must find out how we come to know about cause and effect. Right? And so if we have an idea, we have to get the idea from somewhere, and that somewhere ultimately has to result in some kind of experience for an empiricist. And so Hume continues and asks, how do we get the idea? This is a little bit of philosopher's jargon here. The term a priori and a posteriori are sort of corrupt medieval Latin. They don't have really easy translations, but an a priori idea is an idea gotten from pure thought, that is, without any experience necessary. And the idea, an a posteriori ideas are ideas that require some form of experience. And so he argues that a priori understandings of cause and effect are just impossible, right? So he says, present an object to a man whose skill and intelligence are as great as you like. If the object is of a kind that is entirely new to him, no amount of studying its perceptible qualities will enable him to discover any of its causes or its effects. Adam, even if his reasoning abilities were perfect from the start, couldn't have inferred from the fluidity and transparency of water that it could drown him, or from the light and warmth of fire that it could burn him. Right? So again, just like imagine like having an object that you're really unfamiliar with, like, go to a frontier museum and pick some random tool. You're like, what in the world is this, right? Without any prior experience of it, you won't have any idea of its causes or its effects. And so, and no matter how smart you are, okay? And so that's the idea is that, a priori understanding of cause and effect are out of the question. And so Hume's going to argue you really do require experience for this. And again, he puts it this way. He says, if we are asked to say what the effects will be of some object without consulting past experience of it, how can the mind go about doing this? It must invent or imagine some event as being the object's effect. And clearly this invention must be entirely arbitrary. The mind can't possibly find the effect in the supposed cause, however carefully we examine it. For the effect is totally different from the cause, and therefore can never be discovered in it. A stone raised into the air and left without any support immediately falls. But if we consider the situation a priori, we shall find nothing that generates the idea of a downward rather than an upward or some other motion in the stone. This is a very interesting thought experiment from Hume, who's known for his interesting thought experiments. Just imagine that somebody sort of, holds out a billiard ball or a stone or something like that, and says, okay, I'm going to drop it in 3, 2, 1, right? Now imagine you pop into existence right before this person drops the stone, or lets go of the stone, let's say. If you literally have no experiences of any kind, what should you expect the stone to do? Right? And I think it becomes clear when you imagine, like, look, if I've had no experiences of any kind, I don't see how I have the reason to expect the stone to do anything. Or rather, I could expect it to do anything. I could expect it to go up. I could expect it to disappear. I could suspect it to stay right where it is. I have no basis without experience. And this is a point that Hume makes. We have no basis for talking about cause and effect without experience. But he goes even further in his in being really careful in paying attention to what we do and really don't experience. And he, in fact, points out that our senses themselves don't actually even reveal causes or effects, even when we do have experience of them. Right? So imagine like a billiard ball, and so there it is. What are its causes? Right? What are its effects? Right? Again, what do they look like? Right? What do causes look like? Do you see a billiard ball and causes? Do you see a billiard ball and effects, or do you just see a billiard ball? Do you hear any causes or effects, or do you just hear the billiard ball making no sounds, right? Do you smell causes? Do you smell effects? Or, what do they smell like? Billiard balls? No. Right? So just looking at objects, causes and effects are not things that we actually, they're not part of our sensory apparatus. We don't sense them. So now imagine that the billiard ball is in motion. That's how you draw sort of motion on like a whiteboard, right? Without an animation. So just imagine the billiard ball is in motion now. Now what are its causes or effects? Do you see a billiard ball in motion and a cause and an effect? Or do you just see a billiard ball in motion? right? Do you smell anything different when it's in motion than when it's standing still, right? Um, and again, if you hear a billiard ball sort of rolling across felt or something like that, if your ears are very keen, do you hear a billiard ball rolling and hear causes and hear effects, or do you just hear a billiard ball rolling? Okay. Now imagine it's headed toward another one. Let's call it the 3-ball, right? Um, and it hits, right? And you've seen this, a million times, right? One hits the other, is that clicking noise, and then, they both sort of end up changing their direction and speed, right? Now, did you see two objects collide and transfer momentum? Um, did you see causes and effects and an event? Or did you just see a couple of balls and some motion, right? Did you hear a click and hear a cause and hear an effect, right? Or did you just hear a click? Again, our senses themselves aren't actually revealing causes and effects. We don't get them directly from our senses. And things that we don't actually get directly from our senses, they aren't real ideas, right? They're not ideas of real things. That's a part of Hume's upshot here. And again, this is a sort of characteristically empiricist way of looking at the world. If we don't have any real confirmation with our senses, then we must assume that what we have is a sort of pseudo idea, not like a real idea. And so Hume is going to conclude something very interesting here. Hume thinks it's simply a fact about human nature that whenever we experience something followed by some other thing enough times, we just come to expect that when we see that other thing, we'll see, the first thing, or that first thing, we see the second thing following it. And that's just a kind of automatic habit, right? It's not so much a fact about the world, it's just a kind of habit that we get into when we have a certain kind of experience often enough. So we don't really get our ideas of causes and effects directly from the world. Instead, we get them, without, we just sort of, it's sort of just a tendency we have, right? It's a thing we, in some sense, impose upon our experience rather than get from our experience. Right, and so that leads to a very deep kind of skepticism, as many other forms of empiricism do. So you'll see that empiricism and skepticism have gone rather hand in hand here. That there are a lot of ideas that we take as being very straightforward and obvious, but of course, on further reflection, those things that seem straightforward and obvious perhaps couldn't possibly be true. Right, ideas like our ideas of things and the objects that are in some sense the cause of them must be just like each other. Well, they don't have to be, and we don't really have any way of knowing for sure. A lot of times we think of things as features of the world instead of features of our minds, such as the temperature of water, when perhaps that's not the case. And we tend to think of like causes and effects being part of the tangible world, again, outside of our minds, when, again, we don't have any real basis in our senses to assume that. We don't see anything like causes and effects, and so it looks like perhaps we sort of impose that onto our experience rather than getting it from our experience. We have to pay very close attention to try and tell the difference between what kinds of things we get from our experience and what kinds of things we impose onto our experience after the fact. So in any case, those are some of the interesting issues, just a very, very few of the many interesting issues involved in a study of empiricism. And recall, again, empiricism is just, all by itself, just the idea that all of the ideas we get in some sense from experience.